Welcome to the 2020 Greensteading Summit, presented by the Green Dream Project. This is a special series of videos featuring permaculturists, homesteaders, farmers, gardeners, and people dedicated to sustainable living. We thank you so much for joining us.
All right, we're here with Carlton Moore from the Pharmacy Seeds Network. Carlton, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you guys?
We're doing good over here. You doing good?
I'm doing good.
All right, we're doing good. Talk a little bit about your background, Carlton. In some circles, you're kind of known as the professor.
Yeah, that name kind of came out of the woodwork. I grew up here in New York, and my family had a small family farm in the Catskills. So I got a lot of experience with farming related activities. So I didn't actually grow up on a farm, but I've been around farming all my life. My mom's mom and dad had a dairy and orchard farm here in Red Hook. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff in my background. But as a kid, going up to the farm in the Catskills, we did maple syrup, we did trout, we did firewood, we did forest management, all kinds of stuff like ecologically oriented and farming oriented. That kind of sparked my interest in that kind of stuff. As I got older, I got more and more interested in farming, and I ended up working with a local farmer that I know for a couple of years. We did, I think it was 300 or 400 tomato plants and the same number of pepper plants every year for 3 or 4 years when I worked for him. And that was all conventional based farming. He was from that conventional kind of thing. Then I started my own landscaping business, and then that led me back to farming, and I kind of ended up here on the homestead, and I got into gardening, and then the garden expanded bigger and bigger, and before I knew it, I was kind of selling some of the produce, doing a lot of canning, and I was really into the homesteading thing. And I've jumped a couple of different farms locally here over the years. I still rent where I am, so I don't own the land, but I treat it like I own it because I love this piece of property, and I love regenerating soil and ecosystems. So,
Where did you get your technical background? I see Wiz with the Raspberry Pi. Where does that all come from?
Well, that all kind of comes from my dad's side. My dad worked for IBM for 28 years. He started out in the field and worked his way up to a third-line manager. And so he was always bringing home the latest PCs that IBM was developing and stuff before PCs were even a thing, back when mainframes were still the big thing. I got to play with some of the first 12 and 2400 baud modems. So I grew up playing with computers and DOS and that kind of stuff when I was a kid. My dad and his friends were always tinkering with some projects, so I got to be involved with that kind of stuff. And that drew my interest. And then I got into amateur radio and CBs when I was about 12 or 13. I started taking radios apart, trying to tweak them up and learn about them. And I kind of quickly got bored with CB radio, and that got me to go get my amateur radio license. And that drew me into more knowledge of electronics. And then over amateur radio, I've met all kinds of awesome people who are very technically minded and capable. In fact, my most recent job is an IT job that I met the guy over amateur radio, and we became close friends. And so he's the guy who actually introduced me to the Raspberry Pi and kind of got me started on it. And I just kind of took it and ran with it from there and developed my own thermal control systems and that kind of stuff. He's a double E, and he's a really smart guy. And so if I run into a problem on the Pi, I can always go back to him and, hey, ran into a glitch on this coding. How do we get around that? And he can always help me through it. That's kind of how I got into it. So it's a mix of background from my parents and amateur radio, and it kind of just keeps escalating in a technical direction, I guess.
And do you have any history with permaculture?
Not formally, but for a while, the Jeff Lawton and Bill Mollison permaculture course, that 72-hour course, was available on YouTube. And I went through that whole course. I binge watched that in about a week because I was just addicted to those guys' personalities, because they're just really cool people, and also to the permaculture concepts. So I went through that whole thing, although I don't have a formal permaculture certificate. Someday, if I have the budget to go back and take the course, I'd like to go do that in person and actually be certified. But I love those practices and principles, and they integrate really well with regenerative farming.
Yeah, I love the combination of the technology with permaculture. Those things can absolutely go hand in hand to create such a efficient system.
Yeah, I really like the combination of using, as much low-tech stuff as you can, like the hydraulic ram pump that I use for watering. I love that combination with stuff like the Raspberry Pi on solar power and stuff. You can take the base level of permaculture and maintaining ecology and then add some really nice details on top of that to really make it a very powerful and flexible tool as far as, building soils, maintaining your farm, and keeping things monitored and controlled as necessary.
So, I mean, in terms of some of the technology you're using with your greenhouse, like automation systems, what kind of benefits are you seeing and results?
The biggest benefit is just knowing what's going on in the greenhouse all the time, and so not end up losing plants. Like if a vent fails in a greenhouse and you don't have a monitor on it, on a sunny day here, that greenhouse will be 120 degrees in 10 minutes if the vent doesn't open. I'd say that's the biggest advantage of it. I also use that integrated with a thermal mass system and a wood stove for heating in the winter. And so there's about 30 sensors in my greenhouse that are thermal sensors, and they monitor everything from stove temperatures to water tank temperatures to air temperatures to outside temperatures, humidities. And I've written code that takes all that data and compiles it and looks at, what's the outside temperature, what's the inside temperature, and makes greenhouse adjustments based on that. The biggest advantage from that is that thermal mass system. I have a 275-gallon tote in there as a thermal mass tank, and several other tanks. There's a 40-gallon stainless steel pot on top of the stove in the greenhouse. There's a coil in that and a pump. And so whenever that pot has excess heat, it pumps it off to that thermal mass tank. And that makes it so I can quit stoking on a cold winter night about 2 a.m. here, and it'll hold the heat over until the sun comes up and the greenhouse cannot freeze out. So that's saved me a lot of time and concern.
Do you have any recommendations for people trying to set something up for temperature control or working with thermal mass?
Yeah, that temperature regulation is so critical. It's so easy to go too cold or too hot. In a greenhouse, I've never had a glass greenhouse, but I have a plastic covering on mine. And that plastic covering is basically just stops air from moving. Other than that, there's not a lot of insulative factor there. My friends on the radio tease me oh, you don't need to stoke that late. It's like, yeah, you really do, man. On a 10-degree night, if you don't keep it warm in there, it's going to drop really fast. The larger the thermal mass you can provide, the better. Water is really the preferred medium for that because it's easy to transfer, it's easy to heat, and with a small, very low power pump, you can move that water around and consequently move the heat around inside the greenhouse. One thing I would say, if you're building a greenhouse, I would orient it so that the long way is east-west, and I would insulate that entire back wall, everything from the peak back. I did not do that in my greenhouse. Just kind of built this from scratch, really out of logs in the back, and just got some plastic and covered it. But I would say that's a huge factor. That will make a huge difference in how much heating and cooling you have to be concerned with. The other huge factor is venting. During the winter, you don't have to really do any venting here in our climate, at least. But boy, I'll tell you what, when spring comes, you better be prepared to move some serious airflow to keep it cool in there. Even by April here, if you don't have that vent open by 10 in the morning, that place will be 120 degrees and you'll have plants frying in there. Really good airflow management, the ability to exchange air, and then the ability to capture and hold heat for the cold nights. So it's like you really have to be able to manage those real high and low extremes effectively and respond quickly. You have to be able to respond quickly. So if you're venting a greenhouse, I would say whatever vent size you think you need, double it, triple it.
You've been actually there might be doubters on thermal mass, thermal mass, that doesn't really work, but you've actually been keeping track of it. You've been keeping track of that data, and you've seen those results firsthand.
Yeah, it works really well. Like I said, I have all the thermal sensors in there. I log all the data in my greenhouse. Every minute, those sensors go through, it pulls all the sensors, it logs all that data to a database. And then from that database here on my local computer, I have a live chart that shows me the last 24 hours of every sensor on there. And you can really see, when I'm running the wood stove, you can see that thermal mass, accumulating heat. And then when I dial that back and, go to sleep, the next day when I get up, you can see where that thermal mass has climbed as the stove was running hot. And then on the overnight, once I shut down, you can see that thermal mass temperature drop, and you can see the greenhouse kind of stay steady. It's amazing. You can really see on the chart how effective that really is. It makes a huge difference. I would say with thermal mass, the medium you use is really important too. Rock and clay and the stuff like you guys are doing is excellent. That has tremendous ability, but water is a little bit denser. Ideally, I think what I would do is I'd combine the two of them. Use the water as a way to exchange when you want to exchange faster, and the rock and concrete as more of a slower, like a steady base. But the more thermal mass you have, the more steady you can maintain a temperature range.
All right. Well, we've seen some impressive work with what you're doing out there with the plants and the foliar feed. Talk a little bit about like what it is exactly, the successes you've had with it, and why people might want to consider using it.
The foliar feed thing is part of a bigger concept in regenerative agriculture. Basically, what you're trying to do is find and target nutritional deficiencies in your plants and soils and compensate for that by using a foliar feed. You basically spray whatever your nutrition is on in a light concentration on the leaf surface of the plant. They're able to absorb that directly. And because they can absorb that directly, they can respond much quicker. I'm sure you guys know if you go out and put an amendment on the soil, it could take, it could take a couple days, it could take a couple months, depending on what the amendment is, for that to get into the soil and the microbes to access that and make it available to the plants. Well, with the foliar feed, in somewhere between 15 minutes and 48 hours, they can pull that nutrition in and respond. Basically, what you're really aiming at is increasing photosynthesis as dramatically as you can, since that's the engine that really drives plant growth and plant health. Actually, that's also the same engine that drives carbon sequestration in the soil and soil health. And those two are really symbiotic together. They really work together. And, if you can get your soils amended well and run foliar feeds, it's really amazing. You can really improve your yields. Like you can get 8 times the yield out of a tomato plant when you really get it tuned correctly. So you can tremendously improve your yield, and it's at the same time be building your soils, sequestering carbon. And one of the big benefits of that is once you get those trace mineral deficiencies sorted out, now you have a plant that's so healthy that pests and diseases can't attack it. There's something called the plant health pyramid. And as you climb up that plant health pyramid, plants produce more and more complex compounds, phytoalexins and flavonoids and all these like wild compounds that plants create to defend themselves. The amounts that they produce of those things go up tremendously. So if you get a plant that's on like level 3 on the plant health pyramid, it should be able to defend itself against like aphids and spider mites and that kind of stuff. But like a plant on the 4th level, the highest level of the plant health pyramid, they have had potato bugs actually explode in the field when they started chewing on the plants, because the ratio that they would normally consume of those leaves, the ratio of nitrogen to sulfur or something like that, is so different that they actually get to a point where they can't digest the plant material, and instead they get fermentation and they actually blow up. So it's a really cool way to defend your plants, and in the process, you're growing healthier plants. About 30% of the food we eat interacts directly with the RNA in our system, and so it actually directly affects how our DNA replicates. And we can actually turn on and turn off positive and negative genes based on the nutrition we consume. It really ties into a lot of different pieces.
I really like a lot of the things you bring up there. People are battling pests in the garden constantly. And if they're not using pesticides, a lot of people are trying to go more naturally, and they're using diatomaceous earth and neem oil and stuff like that, which is still a lot of work, a lot of resources to try and get these pests. But one big thing you bring up is you improve the soil health, maybe give the plants some foliar feed, you really improve the health of those plants, and they really fend off the pests themselves.
Yeah, they do. And then let's not forget that if you're going to consume those plants, if you're improving the health of those plants, you're improving your own health also. All plants, animals, and humans rely on many of these trace minerals that aren't necessarily readily available in some soils. And those trace minerals are the basis for many enzymes. They accelerate biological processes dramatically. For example, amylase is an enzyme in our saliva. That's the one that breaks down simple starches to sugars. And without that, it would take us forever to digest starches, right? Well, that same concept applies to plants, and there's many biological processes like that. But each trace mineral is basically the basis for an enzyme. Enzymes are basically trace minerals covered in a protein shell, and they act in a lock and key type fashion where they can unlock biological processes, and they can repeat that over and over without being worn out.
Yeah, I think you talked a bit about this, but like plant health indicators, obviously disease resistance, pest resistance, yield. Are there any other ways indicators that you might be looking for or ways to improve overall plant health?
There's lots of little pieces to this puzzle, so to speak. An easy way to monitor your plant health is to get a bricks meter. A bricks meter is for 0 to 35 bricks, so you can see this scale. And you can actually take plant sap samples, like once a week from your plants and look at what the bricks level is. It's kind of a blunt tool, really, but you're basically looking to see that bricks level climbing. And bricks is a measurement of suspended solids in a solution, basically. Usually it's sugars or salts. You can kind of use that as a metric that your plant health is improving. Also, flavor is an excellent one. One of the things I've really noticed since I started doing foliar feeds here is people taste my tomatoes and they go, I have never tasted a tomato that tasted that good or with that much flavor before. And it goes back to that trace mineral nutrition. It's amazing. Well, one of the things that I've used once because it's really expensive to do, but it's a really powerful tool, is plant sap analysis. You actually take about a quart of leaves from the crop, a quart of the new leaves and a quart of the older leaves, and you send that to I send it to Advancing Eco Agriculture, and then they send it to a lab called Nova Crop Labs in the Netherlands. They analyze the sap in that, and they send you back a full spectral analysis of the trace mineral nutrition in the plant sap. And that really is the best way to indicate, because that's like taking a blood sample from us. What's going on nutritionally right now in the plant. And so you can see what your deficiencies are. And then once you know what those are, you can address them through foliar feeds and balance that equalizer spectrum of mineral nutrition in the plant out. And you can really make tremendous gains. The results I got out of that, stuff that I thought I had pretty well balanced, was definitely a little out. So I was able to start correcting those this year, and I'm already seeing the results in just the speeding of the growth of the plants this year. And I can't wait to see later in the season how that comes out, having made amendments and taken adjustments. Another excellent tool, if you have a pH meter and you can harvest the plant sap, you can actually look at what the pH of the plant sap is. Plant sap pH on a truly healthy plant will be about 6.4. I think if plant sap pH goes up, you have a higher probability of insect attack. And if it goes below 6.4, you have a higher probability of a fungal type attack. So those are a few of the tools you can use. Some are more expensive than others. Obviously, one of the best tools you can have is visual. If you're using visual indicators, plant sap analysis can show you a deficiency 2 to 3 weeks before it will visually appear on the plants. So you can actually detect it early and make corrections before the plant's health starts to crash.
Now going back to the foliar feed. Now sometimes, let's say an industrial farmer, they're trying to get their crops to grow. Obviously, soil health is important because the plants will communicate with the microbes in the soil in order to transfer those minerals to turn it into nutrients that the plants can take up. A lot of farmers will resort to your artificial nutrients.
Chemical fertilizers, yeah.
Now with the foliar feed, that is going through the leaves of the plants. Since they're getting those nutrients more readily available from the leaves, maybe not necessarily from the roots, does that somehow negatively impact the soil? Or does it make the plants lazy like your artificial?
That's a great question, though. No, what that does really is it balances that nutrition from an effective standpoint instantly in a plant timeline, I guess you could say. Once that photosynthesis accelerates, now that plant has all this excess energy. And guess what it does with excess energy? It makes that excess sugars. And those excess sugars go back into the root system in the form of exudates. And those exudates feed the microbiology in the soil. So what you get is accelerated plant health, with the plants with much more energy. When they have excess energy, they can send that to the soil. Now they're feeding the microbes. Now those microbes can unlock more mineral nutrition and feed the plant back faster. And this cycle actually accelerates itself. So instead of getting lazy, it actually makes them more robust and more excited to grow. It's one of the best tools you can have actually for building soil. The majority of the carbon that is in our soil comes from photosynthesis. And that's really how you can build massive soil carbon and massively healthier soil in very short periods of time. And I've seen it here in the last 3 or 4 years on the farm here. The plots that I've had in foliar feed programs, like there was one I had in a foliar feed program, very intensive for 3 years. And then the plot next to it, I hadn't really developed yet. And you can see there's a line where that soil is visibly darker where I was running the foliar feed program, right next to a spot where it's not as dark. It's really a definitive difference. The minute you put those chemical fertilizers down in the soil, they kill off a lot of that biology. And once you compromise that biology, you've lost it for the entire rest of the growing season. And so now you're dependent on a liquid-based fertilizer, whereas truly healthy plants are using the microbes in the soil and they're actually consuming microbial metabolites. And those are available but not soluble forms of that nutrition, which means that they don't leach out of soils. And I guess I should mention that like the foliar feeds these are not comprised of chemical fertilizers. Most of them are made from like a deep cold seaweed, or rock dusts. I use Advancing Eco Agriculture products because I was making my own compost teas and stuff, but it's impossible without your own science lab to know exactly what you're making and exactly what the nutritional content is. So you could go and get a plant sap test, and then if you go to put a foliar feed on, you have no idea what the actual ratio in it is or what you're actually targeting. But that doesn't mean that those sort of things can't be used to build your soils. You know, you could still be putting down compost teas or drenches or organic mulches, that kind of thing.
Is there anything you want to talk about? Do you have any advice for people looking to maybe getting into a more sustainable type of agriculture?
Definitely one is keep your soil covered. And I'm just as guilty. You know, I use the rototiller here a lot to try and control weeds and stuff. And like this year, we've had sort of a drought here. Ordinarily, I'll go out and mow large chunks of like our fields here, and I'll rake that up and I'll use that for mulch to protect the soil. This year, I haven't been able to do that. And I got to tell you, the amount of irrigating I'm doing to compensate is probably 10 times what it would be with a good mulch system. So you're not protecting microbes and you're not protecting the moisture in the soil whenever you don't have that soil covered. And when I say soil covered, it doesn't have to be in mulches. It could be in cover crops. I have put in buckwheat crops in between my corn here. And actually, I was just looking last night, they're just germinating, which is really exciting. But those will come in and fill. And then now, instead of just having mulch sitting on the soil cooking down, we actually have green plants photosynthesizing and injecting more exudates into the soil. So you're actually able to build the soil faster.
All right.
Ton of great information.
A lot of great information. If anyone out there has not checked out the Farmer Seeds Network on YouTube, so much great information on this man's channel. Definitely go check that out. Carlton, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Hey.
It is an absolute honor to have you over.
It's a real honor to be on you guys' channel. I appreciate you guys and everything you're doing.
Once again, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to check out the other summit videos as well. They'll be available for a limited time on the Green Dream Project YouTube channel. Remember to check out the links in the video description for more information on our speakers and to find out how to get access to all the summit videos to watch anytime.